All right, everyone, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's timely discussion on how AI and digital surveillance are reshaping the workplace. We've got some exciting panelists today to discuss this topic. I'm Tani Elston, the development manager here at Workplace Fairness, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting and advancing the rights of workers. As a reminder, everyone, Workplace Fairness is completely community funded. And while this webinar is free, please consider making a donation of any amount in support of the work that we do. Even $10 goes a very long way. We'll be adding a link to donate in the chat. Today, in today's discussion, we'll be exploring how recently introduced technology could potentially undermine long-standing labor practices, infringe on privacy, and disproportionately impact vulnerable workers. We have very important work here to do today. To help us dive into this topic, we're joined by legal and workplace experts who will help us better understand what protections exist, what's missing, and more importantly, what workers can do to stay informed and empowered. Today's panelists include Lydia Wu, a leading voice in HR technology, AI transformation, with a deep expertise in people strategy, HR tech development, and large-scale implementation. She has reviewed more than 800 HR solutions, managed a $40 million portfolio, and guided organizations from startups to Fortune 500 companies through digital transformation. As a founding member of the Human-Centric AI Council and Technology Chair at the Society of People and Analytics, Lydia reshapes the future of AI-driven HR while championing solutions that balance innovation with a human impact. Lydia, welcome. We're also joined today by Jay Stanley, who is a senior policy analyst at the ACLU Speech, Privacy and Technology Project, where he researches, writes, and speaks about technology-related policy and privacy and civil liberty issues that are a part of the future. Jay edits the ACLU Free Future blog focused on emerging technologies and has authored and co-authored hundreds of influential ACLU reports, white papers, blog posts, on privacy and technology topics. Welcome, Jay. Thank you for joining the webinar. Last but not least, we're certainly here joined by Matt Scherer, a senior policy counsel for workers' rights and technology at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he focuses on how policy and law can protect workers in the face of a rapidly evolving tech environment. A former employment law a former employment lawyer and prosecutor, his advice on many algorithmic biases, HR tech compliances, and data ethics. Mac is also recognized as a commentator on artificial intelligence employment law with widely cited scholarship on regulating AI in the workplace. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. And leading today's conversation is Irene Tung. Irene is a senior researcher and policy analyst at the National Employment Law Project. She is the lead author of the recent report, When Bossware Manages Workers, a policy agenda to stop digital surveillance and automated decisions. Her research and policy has been expertise and instrumental in the passage of groundbreaking legislation in 5 states regulating digital surveillance and algorithm management in the warehouse industry. Irene, welcome. At this time, I am going to turn it over to Irene to get us started.
Thank you, Tani. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. During our discussion today, we're going to cover a variety of topics surrounding AI, surveillance, and the workplace, such as compliance, transparency, bias, collective action, and looking ahead to the future. We'll start by hearing more about the kinds of practices our panelists are currently seeing in workplaces. So, Lydia, let's start with you. You've seen firsthand how companies adopt new tech. How are employers using AI and digital surveillance tools today, and where do you see the biggest risks or opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Irene. First of all, thanks for having me here. I think my guiding principle into all of this is that AI as a technology isn't a good or bad thing. It's really the uglier bits of human nature that sometimes we don't talk about that gets to use AI as an amplifier. That is genuinely what concerns me the most about tech adoption in the realm of workplace and employment right now. So from a risk perspective, this might be a bit of an umbrella statement. I think what concerns me the most is really when technology designers and implementers use their own context and experience as a holistic, all-encompassing rule or guiding principle and starts imposing that onto others without considering sort of the background of their experiences or context, so to speak. But that said, I do think there's a lot of opportunity in AI as well in terms of ensuring fair access and making lives easier. Because one of the primary examples is I came out of the manufacturing world, and geofencing is a bad word when you work in manufacturing. But reality is that a lot of times we had workers who forgot to clock in and clock out. And a lot of times English isn't their first language. So when they had to escalate that to HR and having those conversations, explain that you had a sick kid at home or for whatever reason you forgot to clock out, that's challenging. And that's not fair access if you think about it from a more holistic standpoint. Whereas geofencing can really help because technically you just have to be on premise or off premise for us to know when you're clocking in and out. So bottom line is, I think when it comes to technology access in the workplace, it's not about the what. It's not about the technology that you're rolling it out. It's about the how. What is your intention and how are you executing against that intention and how transparent are you about that intention?
Thank you so much, Lydia, for that perspective. So, Jay, from your civil liberties perspective, what kinds of surveillance technologies are we seeing in the workplace today? And which groups of workers tend to be most impacted?
Yeah, so I think that it's certainly the most vulnerable. Low-income workers tend to be the most impacted. I think that the big thing that's happening is AI. I mean, we've had older surveillance tech in the workplace, audio recording, video recording, GPS monitoring of drivers, monitoring of emails, and so forth for a long time. But the thing is, even if the employers did record all your phone calls and collect all your emails, it would be really hard for them to listen to much of it. Um, you just can't, nobody's going to spend the time to go through it all. But now you can have AI do it for you. And so that you're seeing a scaling up of monitoring through AI. Amazon, for example, in their drivers' vans, they have cameras, they point four ways, including one at the driver. They monitor the speed, the braking, the acceleration, distracted driving. If you sip coffee, it yells at you. If you touch the center console in the car, it yells at you. If somebody cuts you off, it yells at you because you're suddenly too close to the driver in front of you. Sometimes it dings you for going through stop signs that don't actually exist because the AI thinks there was a stop sign there and there wasn't. And these things are counted up by algorithms, and you can get fired if you have too many or not get bonuses depending on that. And we're seeing that kind of thing in there. Also happens in the fulfillment centers. It happens in trucking. There's products out there to micromanage people in restaurants. How many stops per table are you making? And so you combine that kind of monitoring with a rules-based algorithmic sort of way of evaluating people that doesn't address the complexity of the real world. We're going to have a rule that you have to touch each table X number of times per X number of minutes. And anytime you create a rule like that, circumstances arise that break the rule where it doesn't make sense to follow the rule, and so people get dinged unfairly. We see surveillance pay, where people's actual pay is set by these kinds of things. And we see, it's not just video, but also sentiment analysis. For example, if you're on a call, are you rude? And any kind of emotion and sentiment analysis. There's a ton of products out there that are selling that stuff, and a lot of it is very, very snake oily. Sentiment analysis is very, psychologists have proven that like there's no consistent relationship between your facial expressions and the emotions you're feeling and so forth. Um, and now, I mean, everybody talking about ChatGPT and how it can write. It can also read. And so, are you writing emails that are disparaging to your employer? That kind of monitoring can now be scaled up in a way that was never possible until quite recently.
Wow, so lots of different kinds of technologies that we're seeing implemented. And Matt, from a policy lens, how do you see the current regulatory landscape shaping employer adoption of AI in the workplace? Are we moving fast enough to keep up with the risks?
Well, the short answer to the second question is no. Right now, I think we live in as close to a regulatory vacuum as you can get when it comes to workplace surveillance and AI in the workplace. In terms of like hard laws that are on the books that specifically address it, you've got California's consumer privacy law, which does apply to workers and gives workers some agency in how their data is collected and used, including both in terms of electronic monitoring and automated decisions. And there's a few states that have bills or laws, I should say, that provide some guardrails for the monitoring of warehouse workers. And actually, obviously, Irene NELP has played a key role in several of those bills. But beyond that, Colorado has a law that's set to go into effect next year that would provide some basic guardrails around automated decisions, and that's pretty much it. So, like in a few states, you have some very limited protections that are either, confined to a few specific circumstances or don't have that much in terms of affirmative rights for workers in them. And then beyond that, it's the Wild West. So I think that the short answer is that in terms of what's shaping the policy environment, the lack of guardrails mean that employers are getting to shape, how AI is being used in the workplace. And unless you are in a unionized workplace, you don't really have the ability to, influence how the employer is adopting it. So policymakers certainly aren't moving fast enough to keep up.
Got it. And so let's now turn to this question of transparency and rights. So, Jay, many surveillance systems are introduced without workers even knowing. From a policy standpoint, what concerns does that raise, and how does the ACLU believe that employers should approach transparency?
We think that there shouldn't be any surveillance of you that you're not aware of. That as a matter of sort of basic fairness and human rights, that you should not be watched outside of potentially somebody's conducting an investigation based on substantial evidence of misconduct. But you should generally know that, how you're being watched. And that doesn't mean signing some form at the beginning of your employment where you're like, the following list of surveillance might be happening, but that you actually know when it is happening, if that means like a visual or oral cue that like, the monitoring has been turned on, or that it's always on. So that's important. And then, none of that surveillance should extend to anything that is not relevant to work performance, nothing outside of your workplace, which we've seen happening since, Henry Ford sicked investigators on his employees to find out if they were had high moral character or what have you. Uh, and yet that is an abuse that we too often see.
And Lydia, on the HR side, how can leaders introduce these tools more transparently and ethically instead of eroding trust?
Not by going to your legal counsel and asking what the law says is the short answer to that. Because going back to Matt's point, historically speaking, where HR is and where the policy and regulations are, we've always had about at least a year and a half lag. With how fast AI is growing, I would say we're about 2 or 3 years back. So waiting for the law to catch up with what you're doing is probably not the best way to do it. And I know a lot of employers often talk about like, we want high performance, we want effectiveness, we want a high performing team. We forget the other part of the equation. High performance requires psychological safety. Way too many studies have been done about this. You don't have to quote me on it. You can quote the academic authorities on that. Psychological safety requires clarity. Specifically, it requires clarity on three different aspects. Number one, status. Number two, certainty. Number three, autonomy. What status refers to is if you're rolling out a piece of technology, how is that going to impact me? How is that going to impact my job? How is that going to impact my day in, day out, and everything that I do? And are you being clear about those things when you're rolling out technology to your employees? The second thing is around certainty. are you clear about what's changing? Or are you just saying like, hey guys, for the sake of our productivity and everything else, this is a new piece of technology that's going to be in the background. Don't even worry about it. Don't think about it. It's going to give you some creepy messages on your desktop pop-up, but don't think about it. Don't worry about it. That is not helping with any technology rollout or any form of trust equation in the organization. So you need to be very clear about what is changing, and how it's impacting someone. And the third piece, autonomy. That's a piece that I think we either conveniently neglect sometimes in the workplace, or we just don't have the time to think about it, assuming best intent here. And with autonomy, it comes down to the question of, did the people this piece of technology is going to impact have a say in how you designed the technology, how you intended to roll out the technology? Did they have a say in terms of how their lives will and can be impacted by the technology? Because if they did, sure, there's going to be more acceptance of it. But if they didn't, well, don't blame them if there is resistance if you never asked the question to begin with. So I think, again, a lot of this is about that psychological safety factor, and a lot of times we neglect the clarity piece around creating psychological safety and delivering that high performance in the workplace as an outcome of it.
Right. And Matt, what legal or policy mechanisms could strengthen transparency and accountability, especially for workers who may not feel empowered to question these practices?
Well, I think that your answer kind of flows from the question. Like in terms of transparency, we need better transparency, not to answer it circularly. But one you cannot effectively enforce even existing civil rights laws without some knowledge of whether, when, and how AI systems are being used in decision making. Same thing with labor laws, when it comes to the use of electronic monitoring in the workplace. If you don't know that an employer is collecting your information and how they're using it, you won't know if the information that they are collecting might relate to your desire to form a union or your protected class status or whatever it is. So, in terms of transparency, I think people should be getting some form of pre-decision and post-decision notice when AI is used in decision making or when they're being electronically monitored. And the pre-decision notice should include like at least enough information at a bare minimum so that people with disabilities understand how the system works, whether or not they basically so they have enough information to know whether or not they might need to request accommodation. And when you think about it, kind of the information that disabled workers would need in order to know whether to request accommodation is kind of the same basic information that workers, as a matter of fairness, should know about electronic monitoring and AI related uses in the workplace that the employers are implementing. And then after any sort of decision, I think workers should be given some sort of explanation. The most important component of which is like what personal information about them was put into the system and what characteristics or attributes about them the system was predicting. And, another key component of that, I would say, is whether or not any of that information was collected through electronic monitoring. And again, that kind of like is how all of this ties together. Like employers are using workers' data in all of these new ways, both in terms of collecting it and then processing it with AI. In terms of accountability, um, one thing is certainly a right to access and any data that is used or collected by workers and to correct any incorrect data. The biggest thing when it comes to AI and decision making is having a human in command. You often hear the term human in the loop. That's not good enough when it comes to major employment decisions about people. There should be a human that is actually, in reality, taking a look at whatever information is meant to inform the decision and making the final decision, and have the AI output be one component of that, but not the driving force behind it. And so there's plenty of decisions where maybe having just a human in the loop is good enough, where, things like minor decisions, like what particular shift somebody is assigned to in a single week, or, what time a meeting is scheduled for them, things like that. But when you're talking about hiring, firing, promotion, compensation decisions, or permanent reassignment to a different shift, those are the sorts of major decisions where there needs to be a human who is actually making the decision. And on that note, I'll just kind of briefly say industry groups frequently in state legislation, which has been what I've worked on a lot over the past couple of years, they basically try to make it a binary choice. You either get human oversight or you get transparency. And it's basically like, as long as you have human oversight, there's no need for transparency. But that's ridiculous. Workers should not have to choose between transparency and accountability. There should be both.
Got it. Thank you. And so, Jay, I want to ask you sort of a similar question from a tech policy perspective. Where do you see the biggest gaps between how fast surveillance tools are advancing and where workplace protections are failing to catch up?
I mean, seems like generally workplace protections are not catching up at all, and so it's nothing but gap. And I guess it would be what I said before in terms of the scaling up of surveillance that AI permits. And also there's a circularity there because it that kind of scaling up also encourages new forms of surveillance because if you can't analyze a bunch of data, you might not conduct the surveillance. Whereas if you have some vague idea that AI LLMs are going to help you crunch a bunch of data, then now you start to actually engage in new forms of surveillance that you wouldn't bother to before. Um, and um, and Lydia said something about, the health, the well-being of workers. And I just wanted to, punctuate that. I mean, studies have shown that employees who know they're being monitored become very anxious. It releases stress chemicals, and there's an enormous, social science literature and psychological literature on what happens when you are monitored. It can create health problems. There was a couple academics who did a study that found that electronic monitoring in call centers created stress levels that were equivalent to the stress caused by abusive customers. Um, and that's something that has to be taken into account very, very seriously in this whole conversation. It is not just some sort of a fairness issue, it's also a health issue, really.
Right. And so, Lydia, from an employer perspective, how are companies trying to balance compliance with innovation, especially when the legal standards are still quite unclear?
I'm laughing because in the utopian society that we'd all like to be living in, it really should be a true assessment of risk, reward, and the greater good, and a combination thereof. The reality, I think, to any HR leaders listening to this or any legal leaders listening to this, it's an accountability hot potato game right now of not mine, don't want to own it, not mine. And eventually you end up kind of going with what your lawyers say or your external counsel say because that's like the safest fallback. And oftentimes the legal opinions you get are what I call a little antiquated from whatever was in the books 3, 4 years ago, that type of thing. So you end up in a weird dichotomy where either one, it kills all forms of innovation, which is I find better safe than sorry, or two, which is what I call the kind of scary scenario where you're like, forget what the lawyer says. My tech vendor says I can totally do this. So off we go and let's go do this thing. And of course, you run the chance of making headline news the next month, next year, so on and so forth. So I think the way to look at it is that it's not compliance versus innovation in an organization. It's more so who is accountable. Who is accountable to the organization's performance? And are we clear about that? And who is accountable to the employees and the workforce and their well-being at the end of the day? And are we clear about that? And are those voices equally represented at the decision table when the final call is being made?
Great. And Matt, you've written extensively about applying old rules to new tools. Where do you see courts or regulators struggling most to adapt existing laws to algorithm-driven decision making?
So I actually think that one of the biggest answers to that is I like Lydia's hot potato metaphor. The way that I actually describe it, like I think about it most in the context of when you're talking about accountability and responsibility for developers versus employers when it comes to the use of AI in the workplace. And the thing that I always use as like the metaphor is that Spider-Man meme where you have the different Spider-Mans pointing at each other saying like, no you, no you. And that's what it seems like with a lot of the both the way that you see litigation play out and the way you see policy debates play out on the use of AI in decision making. You have developers say, no, it's the deployers who ultimately have the employers who ultimately have control over how this is used. Therefore, they should be the only ones on the hook. The employers say, well, we don't understand how this technology works, and therefore you shouldn't hold us responsible, and the developers should be on the hook. And under current laws, it's actually, they're trying to create confusion where I don't think confusion should exist. But um, part a big part of the issue is that developers in the United States, not virtually every state has some sort of trade secret doctrine that essentially gives companies the ability to withhold information, even in the course of litigation, that they say is a trade secret. And the definition of what a trade secret is, and I have a law review article that I'm working on with Jake Snow of ACLU of Northern California that I'm planning that delves into this a bit more. Like that makes it extremely difficult to figure out exactly what the source of a discriminatory outcome is when you're using digital technologies and AI. So that's one major challenge that we have. And it's, in my view, largely evidentiary because I think that once you understand how the data is being used, the liability should be much clearer. But, again, I'm going to probably keep coming back to transparency over the course of this. Like, without better transparency, we don't have that visibility into uh, how decisions are being made and therefore how to allocate responsibility when discrimination occurs. That's even assuming that you can figure out discrimination occurred in the first place. Um, so the one thing that I will say I don't think is ambiguous, but that you hear some people talk about sometime is disparate treatment liability. You sometimes hear people say, oh, well, machines can't have intent. Therefore, you can't have discrimination on a disparate treatment theory if an AI system is basically the one making the decision. And I think that that's malarkey, to use our former president's favorite term. Um, the law says you cannot discriminate against somebody because of race, gender, sex, ethnicity, and all those other characteristics, national origin. Every state has their own view on it. There is no intent requirement in the statute. And if we had access to data and we figured out that a company was using the fact that somebody is a woman or that somebody is black or that somebody is disabled as an express negative factor in the decision making process, I cannot imagine a circumstance where a court would say that's not disparate treatment. And in fact, if you go back to like the original development of the disparate impact doctrine, it is based on that same theory. Like just the fact that you don't have discriminatory animus, that doesn't take you off the hook for using, methods of decision making that are because of a protected characteristic.
So let's talk more about this issue of bias and discrimination. Lydia, AI in hiring and in firing is a huge hot button issue. Where do you see the biggest risks of bias and how can employers reduce them?
Before I answer that, can we just sound clip Matt's last answer for everyone that's about to say, well, the system made me do it, as the reason for whatever may happen in the system. So going back to your question, Irene, I think for me and my observations, risk really occurs in three sort of major categories, if you will. And it's three beliefs that we either consciously or unconsciously carry into a lot of our technology decision making. Number one, it's believing that our past represents our future. AI at the end of the day is a piece of technology. It is a piece of technology that is trained on historical data. I think all of us here know, even if we look back on our own lives, we haven't been perfect. Our historical data sets have not been perfect. So when you implement technology, whether it's for talent acquisition or for anything else, you can't assume that your past data set that is being used to train and customize your current AI tool is going to reflect you in the best vision possible. So there has to be some form of human intervention there. The second piece that is a biggest risk area is the assumption that our preferences represent our needs. So what I mean by this is it scares me when I hear technology vendors say like, oh, and then we'll do this and then we'll get our customer preferences when it comes to talent acquisition. And based on their preferences, we're going to customize like, whoa, hold up. Your customer preferences are not perfect. They may be their personal experience and context, but just because it's someone's context, it doesn't mean that it should ever be a rule that is encoded in the system that is applied on a broader population. So I think we need to kind of discern sort of preferences versus what we actually need from a skill set perspective to fill a role. And the third piece, and this is a belief that unfortunately is still out there, I think it's getting less and less now over the last 2 years, which is the system will do the work. It is intelligent after all, right? Because we're calling it artificial intelligence, and therefore the system made me do it because the system recommended certain decisions one way or the other. So I think those three for me are like the biggest traps when it comes to bias, discrimination, and everything else that is happening in the ecosystem. And I can't remember who said this earlier, but to the point of human in the loop, human at command, human in the loop doesn't mean human at the end of the loop. But we basically have to digest how HR processes are designed in an organization and understand where we need to sprinkle that human touch throughout the process if we're choosing to adopt an AI tool. It's not a don't do AI, but it's more so if you're going to do it, be very, very cognizant about the impact AI is going to have on the work.
Thank you. And Jay, from the ACLU's viewpoint, why is algorithmic bias in surveillance and workplace tech a civil liberties concern? And what should policymakers and employers be paying closer attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a civil liberties concern because it affects how people are treated and whether they're treated fairly. And we've seen a lot of the same issues in algorithmic decision making, whether that algorithm is a spreadsheet formula all the way up to the latest and biggest LLM. And those are, those issues are what is the logic of the decision making? What is the training data that it is based on? And is that training data biased? Um, and I think that one of the issues that we're seeing is that large language models, which are, everybody is driving them around the block to see what they can do. And I think that there's a short term, especially a really strong danger that they will be overused. They will be used in ways that they aren't ready for prime time. They will be used in things that they are not well suited for, while everybody sort of tries to figure out how to play with these things. And while they're, we're at the peak of the hype cycle and so forth. But, large language models intensify a lot of the concerns that have been around since, decision making by algorithm. And even and of course, there could be implicit bias even in the simplest, sort of algorithmic spreadsheet formula. I remember when we were fighting the TSA back in the Bush years, the TSA was looking at rating airline passengers according to their supposed risk to aviation. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to measure whether people were quote unquote rooted in their community. And so your risk score would be based on how often you moved. Well, it turns out that white people and affluent people move much less often than lower income people and people of color. And so even though there may have been no, discriminatory intent there, by using that variable, they were importing discriminatory outcomes deep into the data. But LLMs intensify the transparency concerns because they operate in a way that's even more muddy and unpredictable than other AI systems. The data that they're trained on can be even harder to evaluate, partly because of its vastness, and partly because of the complex stages of training a large language model, where you have pre-training and you have post-training and fine-tuning. Um, and they seem so smart in some respects that they really are tempting people to use them in more decision-making roles, even as they import all the biases. And it's very well established just how much they import the biases from the whole world of data that they are charged on. And then, of course, there's the surveillance issues. So, just to echo what Matt said, I mean, you just keep coming back to transparency, but both because there is so much potential for bias to be baked in that even by those who don't intend to have bias, and there's plenty of people who probably do intend to have bias in today's world. But also just because it's also experimental and it's just brand new. And so we can't policymakers can't decide where and how they need to intervene if they can't understand at least somewhat of what's going on.
Right. Now that makes a lot of sense. And Matt, you've spoken a little bit about this already, but given your experience advising both employers and workers, how effective are current anti-discrimination frameworks at addressing algorithmic bias? And what policy gaps do you think need to be filled?
So, first, before I answer that, unfortunately, Jay, I think we've got a little bit more of the hype cycle to go through with AI before things go into reverse. I I think we could do a whole different webinar about how wise as a business decision it is for companies to be throwing themselves at AI as quickly as they are right now. And there's plenty of evidence that companies are not getting their return on investment with AI. But there's just this morning like a campaign of CEOs that of trying to convince companies to accelerate their adoption of AI even more. So I think that we're going to see these issues keep cropping up. The hype cycle will break at some point, but not in the next couple of weeks. Uh, in terms of what's missing, what policy gaps, like Jay said, I'm going to be a broken record on this. I think it's transparency is the biggest thing. That's not true for all harms and risks that the use of AI poses, even in the workplace. But when you're talking about bias and discrimination, we've got pretty good discrimination and bias laws with strong enforcement mechanisms, both at the federal level and in the vast majority of states. The issue isn't that we don't have good laws against discrimination. The issue is that we don't know when people are being discriminated against. And that it is far too easy for companies to get away with bias and discrimination and to either hide it from employees, sweep it under the rug. Um, you know, People who work in HR and who have the greatest a knowledge of what might be happening in terms of discriminatory outcomes. The vast majority of states don't have good whistleblower protection and retaliation protections, which are kind of like a second order thing that is needed. But by and large, it doesn't get you 100% of the way there, but better transparency about what information is being used in AI driven decisions, how that information is used by the system in order to make its decisions, and what about the workers being predicted or analyzed as part of those decisions. Having that information will get you most of the way to where you need in order for somebody to at least know whether they have been discriminated against. And then at that point, companies are going to start feeling the pressure to make sure that their tools are compliant with the law and are not going to violate people's rights. And it will make them think twice before rushing in to adopt an AI tool, which right now I feel like they don't have a very strong incentive to hesitate. HR managers do not generate revenue. They are only cost on the balance sheet of a corporation. So a company's first inclination is typically if we can automate this process, we will. But if it poses a potential liability risk to them, they'll think twice and they'll want to take a closer look at what the effects will be. So I think transparency is the biggest thing, even if it doesn't get you 100% of the way there.
Great. And so let's turn now to organizing and collective action. We've talked a lot about policy. So, Lydia, how do you see surveillance impacting employee morale and trust when workers try to advocate for themselves?
Surveillance, going back to Matt's point, without transparency sucks. I think it sucks for everyone involved. Speaking as a ex-corporate HR currently on a detox path right now, it sucks even as an HR person trying to implement it with a strong desire of explaining to someone what's going on and being told like, well, what happens if they don't get it? So I think first and foremost, employers and HR practitioners need to disassociate the idea of trust and likability. Just because someone likes you doesn't mean they trust you. Just because they trust you doesn't mean they have to like you. And for me, trust is one of those things that it's like oxygen, right? In the sense that when it's around, you don't notice it. It's in the culture, it's in the environment, and everything else. But the moment it's being pulled away, you start noticing morale, performance issues, and everything else. At the end of the day, the moment you start noticing that, it's almost a little too late to look at the whole trust issue across the organization and address employee morale. And to any HR professionals listening to me right now, no, pizza parties are not going to solve your world's problem. Trust me, I've tried. So when it comes to trust, it's really about three things I think you have to think about before the trust problems happen. Number one, did you do what you said you were going to do? So when you're championing company mission, vision, values, and all that, are you actually living those things, or are those just things written on a piece of paper put up on a poster to look pretty? Number two, it's your ability to execute. When you say you're going to do something, can you actually do it? For example, if I said, I'm going to sing us all an opera right now, yeah, you're probably like, that's cute, Lydia. It's not going to happen. And with HR, a lot of time it comes down to if you're going to promise that you're going to represent the best interest of employees, can you actually do that? Have you been given the authority to do that in your organization? And the third thing I think when it comes down to trust is that do you actually have the best intent in mind for the workforce when you're executing certain tasks? I mean, I think that's the pitfall a lot of HR folks have in terms of balancing a company need versus a workforce need and kind of finding themselves treading that very, very thin line. But at the end of the day, sometimes it does come down to picking sort of which side you're going to align on and operating on the principle of treating everyone like adults. As long as you're being transparent about it, people might not like the decision, but you're still maintaining that level of trust in the organization as opposed to raising a lot of question marks, which could, again, impact the morale at the end of the day.
Right. And if we're thinking about sort of worker voice and collective bargaining, Matt, what role should policymakers play in ensuring that surveillance technology isn't used to undermine those things, to undermine collective bargaining or worker voice?
So here, I think that transparency doesn't get you as close to where we need to be, unfortunately. I think transparency is still an essential component of the problem with that. But unlike with anti-discrimination laws, where there are good laws with good remedies and private rights of action for workers that, they can leverage, there are a lot of holes and weaknesses in our labor laws when it comes to how employers can collect information on workers in order to identify people who may be planning on engaging in union organizing activity, disrupting them from engaging in those activities, and certainly once an election campaign is underway, there's actually a story that just came out this past week. If you Google power at work, how easy it is for companies to hide their anti-union tactics. So I think that there are some more fundamental foundational issues that would also need to be addressed to ensure that surveillance technology isn't used to undermine collective bargaining or worker voice. Um, to the extent that that is too much of a lift, then, I think that the key things are companies should be required to basically engage in what's called data minimization when it comes to surveillance technology. They should only be allowed to engage in surveillance when there is a specific, not just, we want to increase our profits, but a specific, this will help the employee do their job better reason for doing so. And on top of that, they should only be allowed to collect data or engage in surveillance to the degree that it is necessary to achieve that goal. And then there should be transparency about what those goals are and what information about the employee is being collected in order to achieve it. So I think that there is that foundational framework, but the question is like, could an employer still go through those motions, but then use the same information that they are collecting in order to disrupt union organizing activity without it being detected? And again, for that, there's probably more foundational problems in labor law that would need to be solved in order to truly address that.
And so when we're talking about union organizing, collective bargaining, worker voice, really we're talking about power. So Jay, can you talk a little bit about how you see surveillance technologies affecting the balance of power between employers and workers, especially when employees try to organize or advocate for themselves?
I think you're on mute, Jay.
Somebody has to do that at least once a day, right? Sorry. Um, having been a privacy advocate for over 20 years, union organizing has always been recognized by privacy advocates as one of the areas where there is such a strong incentive to collect and misuse information and mass surveillance. And so there are a lot of companies out there that are, data brokers that are basically doing what the East German Stasi did and collecting dossiers on all of us. In fact, privacy invasions going back to the first decades of the 20th century A lot of the privacy invasions were motivated by anti-union activity. There were sort of these right-wing private databases run by super patriots with names like the San Diego Research Library and the Western Goals Foundation, which basically had a lot of private companies creating some of the very first sort of dossiers, sharing them with law enforcement. A lot of these were sort of quasi-private arms of law enforcement cooperating with companies and breaking unions. Um, and now, it seems quaint to think about these guys, creating their paper dossiers on labor activists and the like, and communists and so forth, because of, data brokers have gone, basically nuclear on collecting information about us. And that has so much potential to be, misused by companies. And that's part of the sort of the larger context here. And it shows why, I think that, while privacy activists and labor activists have some very strong mutual interests in overarching privacy legislation, which curbs some of these practices. There's a lot of companies that, for example, share crime data, shoplifters, and they basically amount to kind of databases for sharing information about people who are disliked by companies, and that has a ton of potential to turn into anti-union blacklists, even though they're not being sold that way. There are private companies that are very entrenched with law enforcement. Companies like Flock, which do license plate tracking of billions of plate reads a month of all of us, with many cameras around the country, all flowing to Flock servers. And a lot of police departments and companies like Flock store their data on Amazon's cloud. Um, can Amazon see that? I don't actually know the technology. I should, and that might depend on contractual agreements, but also on the technology, whether it's end-to-end encrypted and so forth. But there's a lot of potential for big companies that are facing labor actions like Amazon to leverage, their connections with law enforcement and their services to law enforcement in terms of data as law enforcement gets more and more data centered. And of course, there's a long history of law enforcement serving not as neutral arbiters, and peacekeepers in labor movements, but and taking the side of employers. Um, so that's how I see technology affecting potentially the balance of power, especially as I hope we see, and continue to see an invigorated labor movement in this country. That those could really become issues.
Right. Well, that's a very bleak picture that you've painted, and that we've sort of painted throughout
Oh,
this.
sorry, I'm paid to be paranoid.
No, I mean, I think it's the reality that we are facing. So let's now turn towards the future and what possible bright spots there might be. And so, Jay, I guess if you can talk a little bit about looking ahead, what the future of workplace surveillance might hold, and what principles that the ACLU believes should guide how we regulate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there isn't a technological solution. I think that that workers need to have more real world power, which means building a labor movement, and seeking better regulations from policymakers and having more political power in the legislative arena. There's no shortcuts, I think, to that, at the end of the day. I'm pessimistic short term, but I'm kind of optimistic long term because I think at the human level, excessive surveillance is just intolerable. And so in history, we've seen a number of times where new technologies emerge, like the telegraph. And the telegraph companies were monitoring everything. They were making trades on Wall Street based on inside information they got from reading everybody's telegraphs and so forth. But eventually, we had telecommunications privacy laws put in place. It took a couple decades. So I think that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards privacy or something like that. And so um, I tend to be a long-term optimist, but I think that right now, it really is, the technology is creating huge new powers, and those powers are not being counteracted by any other forms of real-world power. And in terms of principles, it's kind of what I said before. There shouldn't be surveillance you're not aware of. It needs to be transparency. Lawyers have the right to grievance procedures to dispute inaccurate and misleading data, which we're not seeing. For example, in the Amazon example I started talking with, where literally bots are firing people with no human review, and people are getting dinged for going through stop signs that don't exist, and they try to appeal. I didn't get my bonus this week because I ran through a stop sign, but there was no stop sign there. Your AI was wrong, and they try to appeal, and they can't get a human to respond. Um, that's not right, and I agree. Um, that yeah, so I think that those are some of the principles we would talk about, as well as some of what was discussed earlier today.
Great. And Lydia, what role should HR leaders and tech developers play in shaping a more worker-centered, ethical approach to AI?
For sure. Before I answer that, so Jay, I am totally with you. There are days I have to force myself to be an optimist working in the world of AI because otherwise I'd be crying under a rock most days. Going back to the question, I think a lot of it comes down to we talked a lot about transparency. I think the other side of transparency is don't be lazy. Do the work, ask the hard questions, and really think things through. So for me, the focus is yes, transparency, don't be lazy. Layer in that level of humanity and layer in the level of explainability in what you're designing and what you're rolling out. So before you buy a piece of technology, yes, it's shiny. Yes, it's cool. Yes, it's got a burst of rainbow colors because UI design is everything in technology today. Ask yourself the question, is it actually helpful? Who is it being helpful to? And is there any chance that I'm leaving someone behind while I'm adopting this piece of technology? And the most important thing I would say to all HR practitioners is that if you're going to roll out a piece of technology, ask yourself, can I actually explain how this technology works? Because if you can't explain it, your end users are not going to get it. And there's just going to be a confusion cycle all around in terms of what happened, how it happened, and where data is going across the board.
And Matt, where do you see the biggest opportunity for bipartisan or cross-sector alignment on worker protections in the AI era?
So it's actually something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially honestly over the past couple of weeks, as the political temperature has gone up a lot in the country. And um, once again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but transparency seems to be something that really cuts across ideological and party lines when it comes to AI data and surveillance in the workplace. On this, like there was a project that I did, and the report on it was published earlier this year. It's called "What Do Workers Want?" And it asked workers in a format called a deliberative poll, basically to reflect and talk amongst themselves about what sorts of surveillance they thought was acceptable and unacceptable. And there was some nuance in there, like workers didn't say employers should never be allowed to monitor us, but they wanted there to be a good reason for it. And they wanted there to be guardrails against, harmful or exploitative uses of it. And the one thing that was just almost unanimous agreement on is that employers should have to tell you when and why and how they are collecting your information, and when they are using AI to monitor you. So that's something that really seems to cut across party lines. And it fits with just common sense. And I think that again, you're not going to get agreement from conservatives on bias and discrimination on whether and how to approach that. But again, in my view, if you get good transparency, you at least then are able to make sure that existing discrimination laws work effectively, which gets you a lot of the way there. And there is also increasing evidence that conservatives are, or at least conservative voters, not conservative politicians, are becoming much more favorable and open to labor unions. So, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for cross sector alignment that starts with kind of just the basics of common sense, transparency, and accountability that we've been talking about.
Great. And so we have just a few minutes left. Let's wrap up with some practical takeaways. If there's just very quickly any advice that you can offer any worker who feels uncomfortable or harmed by surveillance practices, what can they do right now to protect themselves or push back?
I can go first. So this is a little behind the scenes tip, if you will, for anyone listening to this. When it comes to HR technology design as well as HR process design perspective, we always design what I call sort of like a secondary path in the sense that if you don't want to be opted in, there should always be a method of how you can opt out. Now, it's going to take a little work across all parties. It's going to take a little work on your end to make that request to opt out, and it's going to take a little paperwork and a little time. But from a pure design process and technology perspective, there is and will always be a way for you to put your hand up and say, like, actually, I need an alternative. This isn't working for me.
Right. So I think that we will have to end our panel there. Thank you so much to Lydia, Jay, and Matthew for such a rich and thoughtful conversation. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. We encourage you to all continue learning, stay engaged, and be a part of shaping the future of work in a way that protects people and their rights. I'm going to turn it over to Tani for some final words.
Thank you, Irene, for your expert moderation today, and to all of our panelists for joining this critical conversation. If you haven't had a chance yet and enjoyed the conversation, consider making a contribution in any amount to workplace fairness or get involved as a volunteer, content contributor, or a partner. We're always looking to add advocates to our community. On behalf of Workplace Fairness, thank you again for being a part of this conversation and for being a part of a community that stands for fairness, dignity, and justice for workers' rights. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.